Many communities participated in the development of salsa music, but what about the African American musical community? Are there any African American elements in salsa? Well, we'll find out in this video. So welcome to Salsa Goals. As mentioned in previous videos, the family of rhythms that form the foundation of salsa music started with a marriage of West African and European musical styles that mainly occurred on the island of Cuba. A very strong African influence dominates these Afro-Cuban rhythms, perhaps because the Africans who were taken to Cuba and other parts of Latin America were allowed to maintain a direct connection with their musical traditions to some extent. However, the Africans who were taken to the United States were not allowed to retain their music in the same way, and as a result, they were basically cut off from their African musical traditions. However, even though that musical door to rhythms direct from Africa was closed to them, these African Americans opened up a huge window of new musical innovation and went on to develop some of the most popular musical genres in the world, such as jazz, blues, soul, and many others. But why is that important? Well, as discussed in a previous video, remember that the Cuban musical community was essential in laying down the foundation for salsa music. And when Cuba was suddenly taken out of the picture, then the Nuyorican and the Puerto Rican musical communities stepped up to play a major role in preserving and updating that musical foundation. But how did the African American musical community contribute to salsa music? Well, first we need to understand the nature of musical contributions. For example, just as there is a difference between someone who prepares a meal and the person who supplied the ingredients that were used to prepare that meal, there is a difference between the community that actively participated in developing a musical style and the community that created the musical elements which were used in the development of that musical style. So, although the African American musical community may not have directly participated in the development of salsa music, a musical genre that was created by the African American musical community was used to develop salsa music, namely jazz. Jazz from the era of swing music had already been incorporated into the Cuban mambo music that was popular at New York City's Palladium Ballroom in the 1940s and 1950s. But when the Cuban musical scene was cut off from the United States, then musicians mainly from the Nuyorican and Puerto Rican communities, along with others, took over and preserved those Afro-Cuban rhythms that were already so popular. And along the way, they also upgraded those rhythms by adding elements of contemporary jazz to the music, thereby making the melodies and harmonies more complex. In fact, for me, this incorporation of jazz is the main ingredient that distinguishes salsa music from the simpler, more traditional Afro-Cuban rhythms that make up the foundation of the music. And we haven't even discussed the subject of salsa dancing yet, but the bottom line is that we can't really talk about salsa music without including the elements from the United States which contributed to its development. These North American musical elements became part of salsa music's DNA, so to speak, and one of those main elements is jazz, a genre created by the African American musical community. So here's that bonus piece of information. While African American musicians didn't directly contribute to the development of salsa music, some of them did directly collaborate in the creation of its sister genre, Latin jazz, or specifically Afro-Cuban jazz. Cuban musicians such as Machito, Mario Bauzá, and Chano Pozo joined forces with African American musicians such as Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and many others to pioneer Afro-Cuban jazz. But Latin jazz is another story. But when it comes to salsa music, however, well, it's easy to see why the name salsa is so appropriate. Because just like salsa is a sauce with many ingredients, salsa music truly has many ingredients because of the various international communities that have contributed to its development over the years. And this may be why it's so incredibly popular all over the world. In fact, that's the beauty of salsa music, the unique ability to unite so many different people from so many different cultures on the same dance floor. Many around the world love salsa dancing, but if someone asked you, what is salsa music, what would you say? How would you define salsa music exactly? Where does it come from? Cuba, Puerto Rico, somewhere else? Who is responsible for it? Well, today we're going to examine those very questions. Remember that the most important part of a house is arguably its foundation, and salsa music has a very old foundation that goes back to colonial times. When enslaved Africans were taken to Latin America, they took their musical traditions with them, and many of those West African musical rhythms were combined with European musical styles, as well as some native musical elements from the indigenous American population, and this resulted in new musical fusions that are still popular in many countries throughout South America and the Caribbean today. And just like different chefs can each use the exact same ingredients and still create different dishes, different communities in Latin America created different rhythms that were all derived from the same African and European musical ingredients. However, although the rhythms developed in all of these Latin American countries are great, the particular group of Afro-Latin rhythms that was used as the main basis for much of today's salsa music happens to have been mainly developed on the Caribbean island of Cuba. Now, this doesn't mean that places like Puerto Rico and others didn't have great Afro-Latin rhythmic styles of their own, because they definitely did. It just means that based on the way events worked out, the specific rhythms that became popular in the United States and that were used to form the main foundation of today's salsa music are mostly from Cuba. These include rhythms like danzón, rumba, which has three main forms such as yambú, Colombia, and the popular guaguancó. And let's not forget what is arguably the most influential Cuban rhythm when it comes to the salsa music and dance of today, the son cubano. These rhythms gave birth to other rhythms such as bolero, mambo, cha-cha-cha, and many other rhythms, including the rhythm which probably serves as the main blueprint for today's salsa music, the son montuno. And these various Afro-Cuban rhythms have one thing in common. They all are composed around the 5-beat rhythm known as the clave, which sounds like this. This clave rhythm serves as the glue that holds everything together, and this clave pattern was developed from an African rhythm and is very important for salsa musicians. Now, these Afro-Cuban rhythms quickly became popular all over the world during the first half of the 20th century, and starting around the year 1948, Cuban rhythms such as mambo, cha-cha-cha, and pachanga became extremely popular dance crazes in the United States, particularly at venues like the Palladium Ballroom in New York City. And with that, the musical foundation for what would come to be known as salsa was already under construction. But then, something happened that changed everything. In 1959, a new government took over in Cuba. As a result, the political relationship between Cuba and the United States changed dramatically, and the two countries soon stopped doing business with each other. This effectively created a musical wall which separated the Cuban music scene from the music scene in the United States, thereby taking Cuba out of the picture. From that point on, Cuban-based music in the United States and the music in Cuba continued to develop, but independently, along different trajectories. For many years, music lovers in the United States didn't really know what was happening with the music in Cuba, and music lovers in Cuba apparently didn't know what was happening with this music in the United States. Now, although some sources barely mention or even skip over this event completely when examining the history of salsa music, this was actually perhaps the most important event in salsa music history. Not because it directly contributed anything to the development of the music itself, but because these new circumstances changed who was in control of developing the music. And this changed how the music developed in the United States versus how it continued to develop in Cuba. This also explains why salsa music is the way it is today. In other words, before the political situation changed, Cuban music was extremely popular in the United States, and Cuba had been the source of musical collaboration and inspiration for many musicians. But when Cuba was cut off from the United States, musicians from Cuba could no longer go to New York to record their music, and musicians from the United States could no longer travel to Cuba. So now that the Cuban music scene person was no longer in the driver's seat, so to speak, someone had to keep the car moving. After all, many in the United States still love to dance to hot Cuban rhythms like mambo and cha-cha-cha, and they weren't about to stop because of politics. Many excellent Puerto Rican musicians from New York City, such as Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, and others, were already very famous for playing these Cuban rhythms. So, many of these musicians from New York City's Puerto Rican or Nuyorican community, as well as musicians from the island of Puerto Rico itself, stepped up and took the lead in three important ways. 1. By preserving these rhythms for those in New York City and elsewhere who loved them. 2. By perfecting these rhythms. And 3. By spreading them all over the world and making them even more popular, thereby establishing the Puerto Rican and Nuyorican communities as major sources of the music which we now know as salsa. Remember that the foundation of salsa music consists of a group of Afro-Cuban rhythms, but this group of rhythms grew larger when a few traditional Afro-Puerto Rican rhythms were also added to the mix, rhythms such as bomba, and also plena. In addition, more elements of African American created styles such as jazz and R&B were added, along with aspects of North American pop music. But how did the name salsa come into the picture? Well, remember that things all started with a group of various Afro-Caribbean rhythms, and each one of those rhythms had a different name. But it wasn't always easy to tell the difference between some of those rhythms, especially for new audiences who were perhaps hearing them for the very first time. So to simplify things, the music began to be referred to as salsa. Now, who first called the music salsa and when? Well, there are many opinions about that, and we'll save that question for another time. But the bottom line is that just as a wallet serves a purpose, namely to keep all of your small personal items in one easy-to-carry place, the name salsa also served a purpose because it simplified a complicated group of musical rhythms for those who were unfamiliar with them and summed them up with one easy-to-remember word, salsa. In other words, instead of referring to each rhythm individually, the simple term salsa became a way of referring to these rhythms collectively as a group, thereby putting them all under the same roof, so to speak. And just as you have a first name that identifies you as an individual, but also a last name that identifies you as a member of a much larger family, the Afro-Latin rhythms that are used in salsa music all have specific names, but the name salsa is like a last name that identifies them as belonging to the same musical family. So, the name salsa really didn't replace names like mambo or son montuno. Rather, the name salsa included all those rhythms in one simple, easy-to-use word, and that made it much easier to promote this music to the world. Furthermore, by putting all of these rhythms under one roof, the salsa musician can easily use and alternate between these different rhythms at will, kind of like the way a construction worker can alternate between the different tools on a tool belt as the need arises. So, although many Afro-Cuban rhythms were extremely popular in the United States during the first half of the 20th century, no one really stole these rhythms from Cuba and renamed them. Rather, the popular musical relationship that the United States had with Cuba was stolen from the dancers and those who loved the music. So when Cuba was suddenly taken out of the picture due to political events, someone had to step up to keep the ball rolling by preserving these extremely popular rhythms, and many excellent Nuyorican and Puerto Rican musicians took the lead. Those musicians have done and continue to do a brilliant job of spreading these rhythms around the world and making them extremely popular among salsa music lovers everywhere. And for that, we owe them a huge debt of gratitude because salsa music wouldn't be anywhere near as big as it is today without them. Of course, many other communities have also made fantastic contributions to the world of salsa music. In fact, musicians from countries like Venezuela, Colombia, and many others have been producing great salsa music for many decades. In fact, salsa is an umbrella term that covers multiple things, and just as the word salsa can refer to a sauce with many ingredients, salsa music has many ingredients, not only because of the many musical elements that make up the music, but also because of the many different communities that have contributed to it over the decades, either by directly developing and making it popular or by indirectly providing the musical elements that were used to develop it. Therefore, no single community owns salsa music or dance, since so many different communities from around the world have played major roles in its development at different times in history. In fact, like a musical ambassador, salsa music's rich legacy can serve as a positive force that can unite music lovers of different backgrounds on the dance floor. So there you have it. Salsa represents the effort to preserve, to improve upon, and to commercialize the Afro-Cuban rhythms that were popular in the United States before access to Cuba was cut off. In addition to the major contributions from the Nuyorican and Puerto Rican musical communities, many different communities have played an important role in developing salsa music, and thanks to them, salsa music is the unstoppable force that it is today. So until next time, remember to stay safe out there, stay connected to the music, and most importantly, keep dancing salsa.